Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Chatham House. Happy New Year. This is actually pretty much our first event of the year. I'm sure it's going to be a tough one in all sorts of ways. Obviously for Ukrainians, but actually in a very different way for Belarusians. It's funny, we're often determined in this place not to hinge events around elections, not least because so many of them in our region are inconsequential. And yet at the same time, here we are with the impact of Belarus's sham election on regime stability, an explicit link. So maybe not so inconsequential. That can be delved into, and certainly will be by Rihor in a second. And Lesia for that matter. So with that in mind, we have put together a remarkable panel of well-tried and tested experts. To my left, Lesia Rudnik, representative of New Ideas, based. Are you in Warsaw? I assume you're in Warsaw.
In Stockholm.
Are you in Stockholm? All right.
But the center is in Warsaw.
I understand. Andrew Wilson, longtime friend of the program at UCL CES, and Rihor Asapenia, our main man on Belarus, responsible for a Belarus initiative, based here at Chatham House, even if he himself is in Warsaw, and the progenitor of all ideas for Chatham House on Belarus. And there's a lot coming up this year through Rihor's projects that he does with us and through us, and look out for an expert comment from him on the website early next week, Monday next week, hopefully, presumably after the result on Sunday night, presumably.
I think you're right.
Yeah, he has written it now. It's all, I shouldn't say that maybe online and everybody, but I'm afraid. And on the other hand, it would be a failure of analysis if you didn't write it beforehand, because in a certain sense. So that's the plan. We'll be here for an hour and a half. That amounts to approximately 10 minutes from each speaker, each expert. Lesia to start on where we are now and the vote itself. I hesitate to call it an election. I suppose if you put sham in front of it, that's okay. Andrew on Western policy, and finally Rihor looking to a future on potential possible succession issues. So that is the plan. We're on the record today. We're also recording this. So that means if you could try not to clink cups and move around too much, and that really helps us to release a decent recording, because if you do that, if you don't, we can't. So that makes sense to you?
Oh, good.
Good. Lesia, welcome. Really nice to have you here. Thank you ever so much. Take us away for 10 minutes, please, and I'll come back at your questions, and so will everybody else in half an hour.
Thanks a lot. So the questions I've received for this panel are quite intriguing in a way, because I'm not sure that I have the response myself, but I will do my best to provide as much input as I can. So the question I would like to start with is whether Belarus is a unique case in relation to other autocratic regimes and other autocracies. In many ways, it is definitely not. Like many autocracies, the Belarusian regime prioritizes consolidating power in one hand, and it has been going on for the last 20 years, 30 years for now. It manipulates public opinion, it represses its citizens and freedom of the speech, political freedoms, etc. And it includes a lot of traditional but also digital means to enhance the repression over the recent years after the recent protests of 2020. It builds economic and political ties with other autocracies, impacting to the broader ties between the autocratic regimes and, as Anne Applebaum called it, Autocracy Inc., and definitely attempts to strengthen its connections with Russia and the East since 2020. In these aspects and in much more, Belarus actually checks all the boxes for the very much classic autocracy. And the reason I'm starting this with this point is actually because when we discuss Belarus, we often start off with thinking that it's quite a unique case. In many ways, yes, it may be, especially for the civil society sector, for the shifts in and types of repression that regime has been influenced since 2020. But on the other hand, it represents quite a classic autocratic regime with many classic features when it comes to this, from the point of view, of course, of political science. So, however, at the same time, Belarus represents quite a significant case of study specifically for the reason that it has transformed over the last 5 years, and it has transformed quite a bit, and from a relatively incompetent autocracy. I would put it like that, because I think that the driving force of the regime before 2020 was primarily the reliance on the loyalty of the political elites, its ties with Russia, but it not necessarily required the regime to develop its tactics of repression that would be smarter, and the manipulation of population, the usage of propaganda. It all has strengthened after 2020, and in many ways it also relied on depoliticized civil society or electoral habits of the population that were not there basically before 2020. So manipulation of election and ensuring the loyalty of elites was the primary source of the regime's stability before 2020. But when it was challenged by the mass uprising in 2020, something has changed, and the regime was forced to adapt its tactics. And in my opinion, it has happened it can be described through three main points. So first of all, the tactics of repression have been changed quite a bit. So from political activists that have been targeted before, the regime has been targeting the general population. It has been also broadening different segments of society, the repression to the different segments of society. But it also has employed a lot of digital tools for strengthening the repression. It is reflected in legal regulation of informational sphere. For example, if we compare the number of laws and regulations that have been adopted before 2020 and that have something to do with informational space, their number has increased almost 6 times after 2020, which signals us some kind of response to the digital activism that had challenged the Belarusian regime in 2020. Besides, there is an increased attempt of manipulation of public opinion. We see the growing role of propaganda. We see the growing ties with the Russian informational space. We also see that the attempts to communicate to the audience, to compete for the attention of the Belarusian population are growing. I already mentioned the legalization of some of the repressive measures. It's not only about the informational space, it's also about other forms of repression, such as extremist lists, etc. So if we place Belarus on the broader spectrum of autocracies, it's far from unique in a way. But at the same time, we can see it as a unique example of basically the example that we can trace in live mode of the autocracy that is developing from a very kind of traditional and conservative to more developed on the way to what Rebecca McKinnon, political scientist, would call networked authoritarianism. And now I would like to move on to my second point. On the two other points will be shorter. On the resilience of Lukashenko's regime. So the question I received was, what factors contribute to the resilience of Lukashenko's regime? And I believe this is very much path dependency that helps us answer this question. At the core of the regime, there is a strong centralized structure. Political system is really highly centralized, presidential republic. And this framework, this structure allows in itself for a lot of manipulation, which provides the rest of the system with the control mechanisms, and basically the whole system is very much loyal to Lukashenko personally. So it's not only centralized presidential republic, but it's also very much personalized state. It is also a corrupt electoral system that impacts to that, corrupt state institutions. And here, I mean, some of them corrupt directly, some of them are controlled and very much loyal to Lukashenko. A lot of legal, procedural regulations within the political system dictate how it serves Lukashenko basically to further reinforce the stability of the regime. Additional pillars of resilience include, first of all, the role of law enforcement and surveillance services that not least during the last 5 years have been changed in quite a bit. We have heard of Belarus before 2020 as the country with the largest number of law enforcement services per thousands of citizens, but now we are hearing much more serious stories and situations with the law enforcement receiving the powers that were not there before, and which are much stronger than in other autocracies, for example, in Russia. It is also the absence of independent institutions such as private education providers or businesses, which could basically challenge the state control. But in the absence of these independent institutions, there is very little maneuver for the changes to be made. So one such centralized system also increases the level of repression as a primary response to the public demand for change, as it happened in 2020. It also sends a powerful signal to its citizens, to the elites, that any kind of dissent will not be tolerated. And this fosters also a closed environment, which is dominated by fear and self-censorship. Which is effectively shutting down normal political participation. So to shortly summarize, it's both the structure of the political system, of the political regime, its control mechanisms that have shifted and changed and strengthened over the last years, and it's a reaction and adaptation of the civil society. So, and this is my final point, these factors of resilience and stability of the regime, they create the impression that the Belarusian regime may actually be strongest in its history and more coherent in a way than ever. However, history teaches us that even the most harshest of autocracies have a chance or have a moment of vulnerability, and we don't see this vulnerability yet. But we might come to this point where the regime will unexpectedly collapse, as we saw on the example of Syria and other countries. So with that said, in conclusion, Belarus serves as an example of really developed authoritarian system, which may be the strongest at its historical point of development, but it's still probably not immune to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessia. That is super interesting. And it does occur to me that after 20, 25 years of talking about Belarus under Alexander Lukashenka, but we do seem to come back to the same issues again. But you've made an important point, which is a change in the shape of the authoritarianism, the type of it going from the traditional to the networked, as you say, more developed, more consolidated, more powerful, more oppressive. And that is exchange. Whether that's reflected in Western policy, Andrew, strikes me as being hard to do. In other words, we want to shape policy, but at the same time, we found ourselves with insufficient instruments, insufficient nuance to be able to do so in the light of that analysis. If you buy that analysis, which I suspect most do. So where are we in terms of the Western position on Belarus, and is it and should it be indistinguishable from Western policy on Russia?
Thank you, James. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, there are a couple of approaches that the West can't or shouldn't take, which are nevertheless worth discussing because of the reasons why that those approaches should not be followed. The first is kind of realpolitik. The idea that Belarus is somehow detachable from Russia is sometimes expressed that is not feasible. That's a strategy for the future, and future here would be defined as Russian defeat. So that's a long way off. Nor, secondly, would a policy led by human rights work. This might sound cynical, but because of the maths, right? We might be able to negotiate a few people out of prison, but there are currently 1,200 in prison. And the bath is being filled or refilled at the same time as it's being emptied. Right? And the main point here is that the system is set up not to work or to only work on Lukashenko's terms. He's basically got enough people in prison to keep that game going forever without conceding on anything else. And finally, the scale, 1,200 in prison, is much, much higher than on previous occasions when we've moved. Right? So there is no moral case, a comparative case for moving this time. So the only possible approach is pragmatic and based on a good understanding of what the regime is currently trying to do. Three things. Lukashenko's goal for the election is to regain Western recognition of his legitimacy to some extent. Ideally for him, having ambassadors return to Minsk and establishing direct communication with the US and EU on at least war-related issues without major concessions, i.e. all while maintaining his strict domestic control. Hence the release of prisoners, despite remarks earlier. Lukashenko expects that Trump will adopt a more pro-Russian, a pragmatic or cynical approach, which Lukashenko expects will facilitate renewed direct communication with the West. Or, to put it another way, Trump doesn't really care about Belarus. All he cares about is a deal between Russia and Ukraine. And once we know what that deal might look like, Belarus can try and pose as a facilitator of its progress. Secondly, the Belarusian authorities are expecting economic challenges this year and in 2026, driven by Russia's economic slowdown. As a result, they are interested in lifting some of the more severe sanctions. But they appear comfortable maintaining the status quo and avoiding significant risks. The economy faces challenge, but is certainly not on the verge of collapse. Domestic political risks are contained, stable, and the exiled opposition has little opportunity to change that. So can we change this pattern of incentives rather than sort of playing a game around them? Bargaining over political prisoners wouldn't change them. Better to push for the rollback of the repressive measures that have changed the nature of the regime since 2020. An independent civil society with media, tiny steps possibly within the country, but more likely abroad, amongst Belarusians abroad. Belarusian society should not remain as isolated as it is now, particularly on a popular level. Crossing the Belarus-Poland border by car takes days at the moment. Obtaining a Schengen visa is an arduous and expensive process. Currently, the only Belarusians who enjoy relative freedom of movement are KGB agents and state officials, particularly those with access through Hungary's embassy. So diplomatic efforts might combine demand for political concessions with the renewal of historical, cultural tourism, regional and informational EU projects. These initiatives would help counteract ongoing Russification, and I see Riho has some interesting figures in his data in this report, and doesn't affect directly Belarus's involvement in the war. I.e., crudely, if we do offer concessions, it should be to the people rather than to the regime. So that brings us to Lukashenko's other aim, which is isolating the normal figure is 1.5 million Belarusians living outside Belarus. We can contrast the situation here with that in Moldova, where the diaspora is similarly large and swung the recent election referendum. Maya Sandu actually lost the presidential vote within right-bank Moldova proper, but won because of votes abroad. Others may know better, but the number of votes cast abroad is zero. Given that there are no polling stations abroad, Belarusians have to go home to vote. This is a big number, and there are two Belaruses. The Belarus that matured in 2014 to 2020 is now largely abroad. So our other policy should be to help it. And not just in humanitarian terms, but as a kind of existential question of maintaining the other Belarus capable of returning or re-establishing its view of national identity, culture and history to any potential post-Lukashenko Belarus. And we can help by making sure there are as few stateless Belarusians in this diaspora as possible, without valid passports and distrusted or put in the same category as Russians in their host countries. And I think we could look at the Tsikhanouskaya's proposal for a new Belarus passport. Maybe others will talk or raise questions about that. Particularly because in many of the host states, there are genuine problems with infiltrators, agents amongst the diaspora, making it unpopular. Or at the minimum, we need solutions for other documents, diplomas, birth tickets, driving license, etc., as an aid to avoiding statelessness. Access to the EU labour market would help for this group. Support for media, NGOs that operate in exile. It is difficult, as I said previously, to try and push back within Belarus, but insofar as Belarusian civil society exists, it does so outside of the country. Finally, it facilitates access to legal advice and psychological support services. Also, general awareness, raising campaigns about the challenges Belarusians face in host countries, where there are some negative discourses about, partly about the presence of agents within their ranks or whatever, but also weaponized discourse about migrants, job competition, etc. Lithuania, already mentioned, is not the friendliest host state. I don't know if that answers your question, James. I didn't really adjust as an answer to it. But yes, it is very different to our Russia policy in that it is, at this stage, small scale and about generally pushing back against the character of the regime rather than getting lost in the kind of forest of one or two political prisoners in or out of jail.
Let's explore that in some detail in the Q&A, because I think I would like to interrogate the extent to which, it's a vassal state, which we are beholden, and therefore what effect that should have on policy. But we'll get there. Let's not do that now. All right. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Delivered with your trademark style and common sense. Much appreciated, as always. Riho, thanks again for creating this and the initiative itself. So we've been speaking a little bit about succession potential, possibilities and scenarios. I know you think, because I have read your expert comment already, that the change is in the wind, in the offing, in spite of Lukashenka being only 70. It's pretty young by many leader standards these days. But you've sort of seen the signs, and in fairness, not just you. Clearly, we've seen the interviews where Luka has talked about the possibility, sort of hinted at it here and there. But at the same time, we've been here before, and this has happened before, and it isn't Belarus more than anyone surely is a sort of fool me once, fool me twice sort of state. So I'd love it if you could explain actually why you think that there is. I don't think it's a plan, but there is. I think you think they're thinking about it. Does that make any sense? So take us through that.
Cool. Thank you, James. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think there is a joke that in Belarusian history there are three main big mysteries. The first one is where is the cross of Ephrasinia of Polotsk, which is actually the main saint in Belarus. The second mystery is where Franciszek Skarina is the first publisher in Belarus was born, and the third mystery is actually when Lukashenko will finally leave the power. And actually, the first two mysteries maybe never be solved. But the third one, it's becoming relatively clear that Lukashenko will live in historical terms relatively soon. And even if you imagine him like reigning 5 years, okay, but 10 years, maybe not. And it seems like at least even people within the regime, they start to talk about that. Maybe if this term, the seventh one, will become the last one. And when he leaves, it will, of course, will be a major event for Belarus and for the region as well, because it will make other neighboring countries in the EU and Ukraine as well more safer, more secure, but in the worst case scenarios, it's actually might be even worse than it is now. And this election campaign, which is like one of the reasons why we're here, it was absolutely uneventful, except probably some statements from Lukashenko, but specifically about his transition of power. And he promised during his New Year address that, well, generation change will come in the next years, and he then returned to this idea once again, etc. So we see that actually, and in a way, you can dismiss these remarks as like mere rhetoric by him, but there are also several other signs that show that, well, maybe something is going on. And of course, one of the main things that is happening is institutional changes. And he already created a new position for himself, the chairman of the All Belarusians People's Assembly. He also introduced impunity guarantees to the constitution. So you see that there are some institutional changes that show that, well, yeah, they're preparing. But the main thing is that Lukashenko is aging. And speculation about his health, it has been circulated for a long time, particularly among his opponents. But now you see that, well, it is happening. And he changed like outwardly, and he has occasional problems with taking stairs or like taking a car to cover 200 meters, etc. So I don't want to go further in details because I feel a bit weird when you talk about physical appearance, but at the same time, it is one of the main factors of the Belarusian regime that exists right now, his health, and it looks like that he is changing. And if you look at the photos from 10 years, from 5 years ago, you see that now it's quite a different person. But of course, anyway, he's not living now. And unless his health worsens significantly. But from his point of view, unlike probably from our point of view, him leaving the position of the president will be one of the last steps for him during this transition of power. While we might think that actually this is one of the main things that's supposed to happen during the transition. For him, it's more about preparation and doing something, preparing people around him, etc. And the outlines of the regime and people who might become president, you can already see them. They are emerging. Of course, there is a clear front runners, members of his family, his sons, who consider Belarus as part of their inheritance, and they think that it should belong to them. Of course, you can see also technocrats who are quite competent, quite loyal, etc. And of course, there is the third group of the Siloviki, who quite cruel, but they can like ask. Maybe they are it's easier for them to ask and to receive help from the Russian side. When we talk about the democratic opposition, it's clearly weakened by years of repression and emigration. And this is why it's very difficult to imagine how to participate in the transition of power for people who are outside or in prisons. And this is why they might not be included in the transition of power. But what matters here is the pro-democracy infrastructure that exists outside the country, and by the end of the day, the Belarusian democratic movement still has several million of voters inside the country. So it's, even if it's very difficult to influence the process of transition of power, the democratic movement is still able to influence how it is perceived by the society. Unsurprisingly, Moscow is better positioned than the West to shape Belarus' transition of power, and Belarus is one of the most important geopolitical assets for Belarus, and of course it has a lot of leverage in Belarusian politics, economy, security sphere, but Russia's ability to capitalize on the transition in Belarus depends on how the war is going and the state of the energy markets. the West, I think that can the West use the transition of power in Belarus to strengthen its interests? I think this question raises several others. What are the interests? Why does the West need to do this? And in general, I think that the West's ability to influence this transition, when it will start, maybe it's already going, right? It depends on timing. If Lukashenko left tomorrow, then there would be little time to prepare, little time to act, and the West would just have to hope for a more reasonable person to come to the power in Belarus. But because this transition is likely to take years, and the West has some time to act and to prepare, and part of this involves aligning with current policies, such as supporting the pro-democracy infrastructure, and which is specifically independent media and civil society, which are crucial for the future of the country. I think that there is also issue of the economic sanctions that still are very important to become a leverage, or at least a topic for discussion with the current regime or the future regime. But on the other hand, if the West hopes to actually to leverage Lukashenko's departure, it would need also to take steps that deviate from the current policy. And first, it must identify who are the tactical allies of the Western interests inside the country, and how to support these people and start doing that. And the second one, of course, it must negotiate with the regime conditionally, of course, about the end of repression. And because if Belarusian society doesn't have several years to recover from these waves of repressions, it seems very difficult to imagine how the Belarusian society can try to use Lukashenko's departure as an opportunity to change Belarus.
Ryhor, thank you so much, Very. There's a lot to get into there, and definitely something you just sort of hinted at something very intriguing at the end there about need to negotiate with a regime conditionally, and that seems a very important point. But I'll just before I come to that, I think the first thing I'd like to do is to ask the other two speakers if you buy into Ryhor's thesis. It's probably an unfair question for you, Liz, as you work with Ryhor, but that the regime is preparing for a transition, looking at the evidence that Ryhor presented. Do you buy into that? That you didn't give a number on it, Ryhor, but you were sort of saying between 5 and 10 years. I don't want to, more or less. And do you feel that obviously change is coming because of mortal coils and all that, but do you feel that they are beginning to think about a transition, about the next stage, the post-Lukashenko era, or are they head in the sand, or do you refute that and you think head in the sand, Lukashenko is president's eternal, et cetera, et cetera?
Right. There are several signals that we should not ignore, and Grigor mentioned a couple of them that regards the establishment of new institutional structures, regards the refreshment of the political elites that happened in July. And I believe that this says something about Lukashenko preparing for the worst case scenario. I'm not necessarily buying the argument about 5 years departure of Lukashenko, but as also one of the victims of Lukashenko, I would really wish to see that happening sooner. But for me, it's a signal of the system taking precautions. It is kind of the safety belt for the regime by securing the possibilities for Lukashenko's departure. So there are certainly actions and mechanisms down there, but I'm not sure that I can see how the regime is preparing for transformation when it comes to particular candidates. Or, we don't have a clear figure. We don't have. There were speculations about Kachanova and others, but we don't have a clear figure. We don't have a clear scenario. We don't have a clear structure for that. Well, the structure is almost there. So I do think that they are thinking, as Ryhor said in the very introduction, or when you introduced his point, they are thinking about that, and not less because of the health situation of Lukashenko. But at the same time, I don't think that what we will see at the moment of transition is going to necessarily lead to democracy, as we know again from the history how the authoritarian regimes are being replaced by other authoritarian regimes, and what kind of influence is Russia going to have at this moment in the region and also on Lukashenka and elites around him.
Andy, is something happening?
Well, the answer to your first question is yes. I do agree.
Yeah, okay, that's a real
prognosis.
Yeah,
and it looks like 5 to 10 years.
Right.
Because you have a new president. Press pause. Another issue is whether we call him that.
Yeah, sure.
We didn't for the last 5 years, and these elections are in many ways less democratic than in 2020.
Sure.
Release pause. So we have a new president with a new 5-year term, and we have these new institutions. So it looks like a 5 to 10 year time period, either 1 term or 2, within which, as Alessia was saying, there is options and flexibility built in. Choice. He could remain as president, he could switch to this other thing, other actors could be involved, which depends on the final thing, which is the nature of illness. Right? Unless he's got a very fixed diagnosis, right, that he's only got X time left, which doesn't look like at all. Right. That's how illness works. You see how long you get.
Right. Thank you. I'm glad we're all in agreement. That's good, I think. Riho, having asked them your question effectively, I've got a couple for you, and then I'll open it out to the floor. So on that level, please prepare your questions, ladies and gentlemen, physically in the room and also online. There's lots of people online, except I just question to Melania and Phoebe. I haven't got any questions yet going through. I mean, if you do have questions, if you can hear me online, then please send them into the Q&A, right, Melania? Because I haven't got any yet. Maybe you could send me a test one just to see if it's working. So I'll expect those. So you've got about, however long it takes Riho to get into this. So 2 questions. First of all, I'd like you to dig into this idea about the West. This is a controversial point you mentioned at the end. You sort of snuck it in there, that the West should begin to negotiate with regime. What do you mean? You said so conditionally. I get that. What are those conditions? And you must understand the sensitivities around that. So I'm not surprised because I know you and we've discussed it in the past. But of course, the opposite view is don't negotiate with a regime, don't touch them, don't isolate them, etc. And that's a reasonable point of view as well. But I know you go the other way, so that's fine. Secondly, I suppose this is linked. I'd just like you to you're asking us to prepare for the transition, and I just don't know what that means in concrete terms. Yep. Okay.
All right.
Go.
All right. In terms of negotiations with the regime, what should be the conditions? I think that I guess that even the regime understands that sanctions are not on the table because they were introduced because of the war, and it's very difficult to imagine how it's impossible to actually suspend them or whatever. And I guess, but what do they want, and what the West can explore is that actually given some opportunities to discuss and giving them, for example, discuss the return of the ambassadors to Minsk. This is one of the issues that can be discussed with the regime, and if the regime will be able to do specific concessions to the West and to the Belarusian society. So I think should be the concessions
on the West front.
Well, at least there is something to discuss.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think this is what should be. And of course, there will be plenty of, I guess, we have no idea what is going to happen about the war, but I guess there will be any kind of negotiations about the war. And I think it's also a topic that can be discussed with the regime in Minsk. I forgot the second question.
How do we prepare for the transition?
Yeah, how do we prepare? I think this, what we should do and what the West should do. I think this is the most difficult issue, is it actually to identify people who can be tactical allies of the Western interests. I think, unfortunately, we already understand that plenty of us are not able to, like Belarusians or many pro-democracy people from Belarus, they can't return to the country. And maybe they will never be able in part. Some of them will be, some of them are not. And then the question is, who is actually going to be helpful in strengthening Western interests in Belarus, and how to support these people in their political life. And this is one, I think, and of course, start to support them. And this is a huge dilemma, I guess, for the Western policy. But it's not difficult in practical terms. I think that it's like it's easy to build back channels to discuss how things can develop in the future.
I like your 2 concrete points.
Yeah, so I think this is like the main issue that very difficult right now to maybe to move on. But without that, it's very difficult.
Without that, you're saying we risk it letting it slip away again next time. I at least I get your point.
Yeah.
Got it. Right. So, floor's open. I do have people online asking questions. Rasmus Olsen and Alex Hubridge in particular, both with good questions. So I will come to them. But is anybody in the room who might like to go first to kick us off? Please, could you give your name and affiliation? I don't seem to know most of you. And we'll take it from there. Please.
Okay. My name is Taras Taroslis. I'm originally from Belarus, and I'm part of Belarusian diaspora in the UK and representing an organization called Professional Union of Belarusians in Britain. I have 2 questions, one for Alessia, one for Igor. And so the one for Alessia, you painted like the evolution of the Belarusian autocracy. Rightfully saying that it's like, in a way, it's now on its strongest peak, and like and without going as far as 5 or 10 years, I wonder whether you could speculate or foresee what could happen to that autocracy, which is already as strong as it is, in the next year or 2 or 5. Like, are the possible evolutions if like the Western sanctions don't work, or whatever, if like even the war continues, or but where this could go. And Igor, as usual, you have a lot of good or like pieces like to explore, and one of them you alluded to the opportunity for the Western like. For the West to try to reach out to you said, tactical allies within the regime. So not talking about like Tikhanovsky and the office and the other groups, but within the regime. And my question is like, at the current circumstances, who this could be?
Okay. Leslie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Okay, I'll try to be brief. Thank you for your question. I don't like to speculate, but I can provide what feels feasible or like doable maybe for the Belarusian regime. So there are 3 strategies or 3 scenarios that I have called in the following way. First is the further consolidation of the regime, which means that the regime is not going to harshen repression much more, but is going to contain the similar level of repression. It's going to try to control this system even more, but without significant peaks of escalation. But it's going to be strict, harsh autocracy that is even more consolidated in the hands of single person or the institutions around him. The second option or scenario that I called escalation is about the matter of how the conflict in Ukraine is going to develop. In case the Belarusian army is forced to enter, for example, Ukraine. Let's imagine this scenario. I know it sounds alarmistic for now, but for 2 years ago, a lot of experts have been talking about this possibility.
Yeah.
So in case the Belarusian army decides or is pushed to join the conflict, for example, then it's kind of escalation that can actually lead to the who knows what protests inside the country, because we don't know how Belarusians would act in case the significant part of male population is actually forced to fight the other neighbors. I'm not necessarily thinking that this scenario is realistic, but I think that if we're talking about escalations possibilities, this is one of the aspects or dimensions of this scenario. And the third scenario is liberalization. Liberalization is, of course, happening under the pressure of the Western countries and possibly in case of Russia's loss in the war against Ukraine. Just briefly,
Who should the West reach out to? Specifically, I think he was looking for specifics, maybe names.
Well, not probably.
Unless you mentioned one.
Yeah, but I think that everyone who thinks that further integration with Russia is a threat for Belarus independence, or is already a threat to independence, can be tactical allies of the Western interests. And I mentioned three groups.
Good point.
Family, people who we call technocrats, and Siloviki. Across all of them, there are some people who think this way. So I think that even without mentioning names, you can imagine who can be tactical allies and who actually were in favor of building relations with the West before 2020.
I think it's a really good point. Anyone who thinks that Belarus's independence or viability as a sovereign state in the future, whatever one thinks of it now, that it's threatened, is a potential ally. Nice point. Okay, there's several online now, some really good ones as well. So I'm going to go into those, but in the room, just put your hand up if you need me. Right, okay. So I'll come to you, sir. But Alex Shoebridge, in the context of a possible transition, how do you see the current iteration of the exiled opposition and their own trajectories? In other words, are we maybe to expand on Alex's question this year, are the current opposition in exile a future government of Belarus, or are we destined to be replaced by another generation or another type to have more influence in the future? So are we seeing people who matter, or is it for another generation?
I will respond shortly. Besides of the example of Myanmar, we have not seen any examples of the opposition that has been first exiled and then returned to the country and became successful politicians. And she's now in prison again. Mm-hmm. So we are, I don't really believe in the possibility. Okay. Yeah, exactly, right. Okay, a couple of historical examples as well.
Yeah, exactly.
but in the current political situation, in how autocracies function today, I don't believe that there is a possible future for the first quick de-escalation liberalization in the Belarusian context, which would then allow the Belarusians who left the country to get back. If we probably have missed this period approximately now. So I think anything above 5 to 10 years in immigration will lead to just, few people, few activists, and maybe few very much inspired politicians to get back. And the fact that, I don't see how they can be effective and popular amongst the Belarusian population in the future as symbols, as historical figures, yes. But unfortunately, it's very unlikely.
Okay. Do you want to come in on that at all, anybody?
Well, I think that in general, it's very important just to support the current pro-democracy infrastructure, but to understand that by the end of the day, new crises create new leaders. And we shouldn't overthink maybe some current figures, because probably someone who doesn't know even now itself, themselves, that they will become someone. So that is why it's just important to support the whole group of people.
Good.
I would depersonalize the question. It's more the bigger question is how much of the other Belarus that matured in 2014 to 2020 survives and is capable of returning in any post-Lukashenka or transition scenario.
So,
I'm Alan Flowers. I'm a British academic who's currently the elected chair of the Anglo-Belarusian Society, which is a British-based organisation. And I emphasise elected because there are some Belarusian institutions that can work very democratically. And I also have to point out I am speaking independently and on my own behalf. Right. And I've only mentioned a bit about Anglo-Belarusian Society because I've been immersed in Belarusian affairs constantly, daily for 30 years now, and hence speak from that perspective, as well as being part of an amazing little group that represents leaders of various things like Taras and Ali's producer here from the People's Embassy, who are in regular dialogue with the British Foreign Office. On that basis, if I may, Chair, fire one question to each speaker. They're different ones. I'm going to give you the keyword, and then I'll embellish it a bit. So the key word for Andrew is political prisoners, 2 words, sorry. Key word for Riga is sanctions. I've actually got 2 keywords because I was going to comment on army, because you mentioned something about the context of possible Belarusian army engagement. I think I should maybe give a little bit of background on that. Although you've now tempted me to have to make a comment about brief comment about return.
Let's do 3 questions.
So 3 questions, right? The political prisoner one. Surely it's so important. I hear so often the real leaders of the democratic movement are in prison. Andrew, shouldn't we be doing everything we can to get these real leaders, the Statkeviches, the Babarikas, the Maria Klasnikova, and you might like to comment on some of the recent softening, particularly there. That's the prisoner one. On the sanctions one, Riga, I rarely feel I have to correct you, but you said the phrase, sanctions were introduced because of the war. Hey, hang on. 2020, 2021, remember the plane coming down? Europe went crazy because suddenly Europe was affected. These sanctions, there are sanctions initially. It was a human rights issue. And I would suggest, could you comment on the extent to which, on the Belarus case, we really got to hold out, even if the war thing is solved, we hold out until the original aim to get the prisoner release and human rights. So a challenge on your comment about sanctions, Riga. And on the army one, I'm advised, and I'm prepared to need the panel to correct me on this, that if Belarus tried to field an army, they'd be lucky if they could get 8,000 frontline soldiers in. I don't think Lukashenka's crazy enough to risk, and that's why, as we know, he's been holding off. Now, you may have something else, so I was quite amazed you raised the army thing. By the brief one, aren't there examples in the Baltics of return of political exiles who then came good in leadership? I'll just give that as an aside. Thank you.
Fine. Let's go to Andrew.
Prisoners, sanctions army.
Yeah. Well, I thought very carefully about how to phrase my comments about political prisoners, because I didn't want to sound cynical. This is a huge number. It's a massive human rights issue. Some of the conditions are appalling. The level is, these are not guilty people in any meaningful way, so it's egregious. What I meant was, this is a game set up by Lukashenka that only he can win. Right? It's been set up for him to be able to play this game in isolation, right? Without negotiating or significant change in other areas. So we have 2 approaches. One is to emphasize the general, political conditions, the legislation that puts these people there in the first place, the behavior of the Siloviki, conditions in prison, or and this is less likely, not to go for the people who are at death's door or whatever, I'm trying to push for their release, but for the highly political few that you named. That would make sense if there were other signs of a genuine political thaw. So these people would not just be released, but would be able to play a role. Currently, they wouldn't. So there's therefore very little sign of the regime moving on that. But in that sense, we could, on the one hand, you're not being ad hominem. You're talking about general process or ad feminem. But de facto, you could say your most dangerous opponents must come out.
Thank you. Real sanctions.
And Sikhanovsky.
Of course.
Because Sikhanovskaya cannot play the role that she wants to roll while her husband is in jail.
Right.
Yeah.
Sanctions.
Well, most of the sanctions were introduced because of the war. In 2022, in 2021, or 2020, there were some sanctions introduced because of the migrant crisis, because of the airplane.
Right.
But it's very difficult to compare the scale compared to what was introduced in 2022, and even some sectors that actually, in a way, for the regime, maybe it is even sometimes funny that actually, for example, Belarusian potash fertilizers are sanctioned more than Russian potash fertilizers because of the Russia's war against Ukraine. But in general, by that day, it's I don't know, I'm not so sure about the percentage, but it's like 80%, I guess, of the sanctions that were introduced against Belarus. It is connected with the war.
Okay, fair enough. That's a good challenge, good response. Alicia, the 8,000 of the army.
Okay, so well, it's as I understood your question, you were asking why Lukashenko is not sending the army to Ukraine, right? And that it's weak, and this is the main argument. Did I understand you correctly?
No, I was more interested in why you thought they would send them not.
Okay, no.
It's pretty obvious what Lukashenko's been doing.
Okay.
He's not sending them.
Right. Okay. No, I was asked to speculate within the 5-year scenario, and that is definitely one of the scenarios. In case we're talking about escalation. Escalation can happen in different forms. One of them is that Lukashenko is pushed to do that. But as we saw, it's not happening. I was one of those who was always saying that no, this is not happening, because I do agree that it's kind of irrational to send off the weak army that is going to be destroyed in a number of days. So yeah.
Okay, can I build on this? It's actually not me, it's Trisha Deborakareva actually. Trisha asks, ultimately the question is how much of a vassal state is Belarus to Putin? But which says at the end of the day, look, you've got Russian nuclear warheads on Belarusian soil, but at the same time, he's said that there's no way that he'd send soldiers. It is a confusing relationship, because it's not as though Putin has entirely his own way in Belarus. That has been proven, apart from Alan's question. So can you, and maybe I'd like to, this is the most important thing for me. So I'd like you to dig into the Russian-Belarusian relationship right now. I guess they're both trying to play it carefully. They're both trying not to overextend or to overplay their hand. Because if they did, they might lose, basically. Or it would require them to make moves that they don't want to make, or don't want to have to make. So can you say a little bit more about, what the last part of Patricia's question is, what does it say about the Putin-Lukashenko relationship? Is it as simple as master and puppet and subordinate master, or is it a bit more nuanced, a bit more complex than that? I guess the other way of putting it is, how much agency does Lukashenko have?
Okay, and not to measure in percentages, but I do share your opinion on the fact that it's not so simple. It's a toxic relationship. It's a complicated relationship. We can describe it as, abusive relationship. But in a way, Putin indeed has leverage with Lukashenko, and Lukashenko has some needs that he needs to cover in the context of the connection with the West that he was deprived of since 2021 primarily. So Lukashenko is, of course, seeking some kind of international ally, and logically that would be the ally that is the closest, that has always been there for him. And even though he might want to escape this close ties, he is forced to be in this kind of relationship, because there is no other relationship, and he needs to feed the country. He needs to stand there as the man who has prevented the Belarus active participation in aggression against Ukraine. So for him, it's also a reward. Can correct me later, but in the recent Chatham House poll, we saw that Belarusians actually see Lukashenko as a guarantor of Belarus. Sovereignty. So I do think that both of them need each other. For me, the main argument for Putin is the international support. He needs an ally who's going to be there as the sovereign and separate country who supports Russia's actions. And for Belarus, it's, of course, economic and political support.
Super interesting.
Lukashenko has always wanted to preserve enough sovereignty to preserve his systema and keep himself in power. That amount of sovereignty has shrunk. He's moved much further on the Union state than he meant to before 2020, for example. He's been forced to acquiesce in the creation of an oligarchy, which he claimed he never wanted to. Not in a full-blooded sense, but you now have de facto oligarchs in the sanctions-busting, war-supporting economy. But he still has enough of sovereignty to stay in power. Not enough for a Max Weber type definition, right? In terms of monopoly on armed force, he's got Russians moving free through his country like it wasn't there. But Putin's, personally, that's always been a problem. But Putin also has a just enough, right? That he wants to be able to fight the war against Ukraine in the way that he wants, which basically he has at the moment, because he knows the Belarusian army would be hopeless. It's small, it's not battle trained, it would be annihilated pretty quickly, creating problems for Lukashenka at home. And in military terms, he has everything else that he needs from Belarus. Unless things go really badly for Ukraine and they want to attack Kiev, and Belarus comes back into play. Because both sides preserve their core demands, the fact that they don't like each other personally doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I'd love your thoughts as well on this.
Well, I think that Lukashenko is the vassal of the Kremlin, but by the end of the day, it was his personal decision
to do so,
because it's beneficial for him. And is he, in theory, able to make another decision? Yes, he is. And he's still formally the absolutely sovereign person, and he has good relations with other countries, for example, with China. And for example, he's using China as a counterbalance to Russia as well. So this is like things that clearly show us that, well, yeah, he's a vassal, but there are plenty of room for him.
So this is a Russia question more than a Belarus question. It's actually Rasmus Olsen's, and it's okay. So let's say that the dislike becomes more apparent and they get further and further apart. So he's asking, will Moscow not just invade if they feel Belarus is slipping further away?
It will invade.
Yeah?
Yeah. Why not? It's the same for Russians. Russians in the same country, like in Ukraine, etc. It's part of the empire. And what they're doing right now is just using different methods in Ukraine and in Belarus.
Well, intent is one thing.
Yeah.
And there are three things that Russia clearly doesn't want: a democratic, a post-colonial, and a West-oriented Belarus. Yes, it would invade if either of those three, if all of those three were under threat. If it was only one, who knows? But probably yes, because all of those three hate to say red lines, not something Russia wants to see. But that's a question of intent. The question changes completely if you talk about capacities. If Russia is defeated or severely weakened, then it might not be able to deliver on intent. It might just have to cope with something it doesn't like.
Yes, you can say yes or no if you like.
I will just briefly say that I don't think that the capacity is the question here. I do think that Russia has enough political leverage and military capacity to invade Belarus, in contrast to the case with Ukraine. But I do not necessarily share the position that Russia will invade immediately. If we're looking at the status quo, if we think that the war is over, or there is a new figure at the leadership who is not sharing the same political course as Lukashenka, then yes, of course, there is a big risk that Russia will do that.
Good. Right. Two in the room. Okay, yeah, let's go to the room in that case.
Yeah. So, Krzysztof Kirzik from the Polish Embassy. So, thank you for this fascinating discussion. I have actually one question, like building up on what you already said. Actually, all of the distinguished speakers, social moods in Belarus. So, So, how efficient is the propaganda in terms of likely transition in 5 or 10 years, whenever it will be? So, where will be the Belarusian society, mentally, and how would you assess it?
Okay, maybe for you, Alessia, I suppose.
Right. So, propaganda is serving the regime, right? As long as we have the regime, we're going to have effective and developing propaganda that has been becoming stronger and stronger over the last 5 years, not least because of the connections to the Russian informational sphere. We're also doing the monitoring of the disinformation on the Belarusian online platforms, and then we can say that at least half of the content produced on Telegram channels, which regards war, disinformation on war in Ukraine, is actually shared from the Russian sources directly. So there is a strong link, not only based on our monitorings, but also on other research that shows that Belarusian propaganda builds a lot on the informational space of Russia when it comes to the international agenda and war in Ukraine. So they are sharing some resources, they're sharing some tactics and strategies. But I do believe that Belarusian propaganda is quite ineffective, even though we have not seen really like large studies on that, on perception of propaganda narratives, etc. There have been a couple of pilot ones, but we don't know much of that. And but I do believe that Belarusian population is much less susceptible to the propaganda as if we compare it to Russian society. Why? I don't have the explanation why. I just believe that Belarusian population before 2020 have been consuming the products of independent media quite a lot. Dubai was very popular. Many other independent media were very popular. And yes, we have quite a lot of people who consumed TV and still continue to consume TV, and that's why it's quite dangerous there. But when it comes to
protests
exactly. So I still believe that as long as Belarusians are offered a safe and free way to use the independent media again, they will do that because they don't like the, I would say that they don't like the language of the propaganda.
Okay.
Judith Fableson, research analyst at FCDO. Interested in this conversation around negotiations. It seems to me that the idea of kind of Western countries negotiating with Lukashenko is predicated on the idea that Lukashenko perceives the West as a useful counterbalance to Russia. And in the past, I think that was definitely the case. Is that still the case to the same extent? And what role does China play? And if it's not the case, then what does that mean for this proposal around negotiating with the West?
Well, I know it was me who mentioned it, but it's on your basis you're doing the Western responses.
So I guess the operational part of the question is, has Lukashenko's view of the West changed? Does he still see it as a useful counterweight to Russia? Well, he has evolved more in the China direction, because that triangle does work well for him. I think at the moment he's almost entirely thinking about Trump, about America, not about the collective West, but just the opportunities. I mean, we don't know how much realpolitik is going to be dumped on us and dumped on Eastern Europe. But I mean, Kellogg's, for example, was supposed to be in Kyiv in the last few days. And people in Kyiv say the reason he didn't is because there's no consensus in his camp about how to start those negotiations. So the policy for Ukraine isn't fully formed yet. So it is a slight change in thinking because it's not about the kind of the geopolitical question. Has that changed over, since 2020? I think it is really a Trump-focused thing. But there are opportunities for all sorts of bad actors to maneuver around Trump.
Right. Unless you've got anything on that, I'm going to move on.
I should probably agree. I just said that actually for the regime, and in a way China and the West sometimes I'm not contradicting things, because actually China also wants Belarus to have good relations with the West. That's why in a way
That's an interesting point. Okay. I'm going to go to our colleague, Anaïs Merin, also in Warsaw, probably. Hello, Anaïs. And two questions from her. One is about the economic elites. and how do they see the looming economic challenges, which I think you referred to? You certainly mentioned it in your expert comment, although you also said that the economy is due to grow by, or has grown by 3.6% in the last year, I think you said. So how do they see the looming economic challenges? Because obviously systemically it's not for the long term, that's what you definitely did say. So that's that. And secondly, just looking for the second part of the question. Yes, back to sanctions. So it's still on you, Rihol, perhaps, although anyone can do it. Yeah, would smarter sanctions have an effect, is what analysts are saying. Okay, better sanctions.
So I'm not the economist, but I guess plenty of economists agree that the economy is growing pretty well, and it will be growing until the war ends or until Russia will face significant economic issues. Until then, I think it will be doing relatively well, and I guess it's growing better than it's one of the most better growing economies in Europe these days. And it's the question who introduced sanctions against whom, right? So, but it is what it is.
But how do you think that the economic elites, the technocrats, if you like, see? I mean, there is a sort of a systemic dysfunction, if you like, in spite of this growth. It's not. Doesn't look like it's going to do well in the future.
Yeah.
So how do you? Is it like in Russia? You know, there's the Siluanovs and the Kutlins, and who are actually, you know, and Nabilino, of course, excellent, actually very good economists in their own right, but they're stuck with the system.
Yeah.
Is that similar in Belarus?
In a way, yes, but these people are less prominent publicly.
Right.
But by the end of the day, there are plenty of people who understand how things work here. And,
so they have to work within a much more constructive framework, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Than a Western treasury.
Yeah. So they are relatively good in what they're doing. But at the end of the day, it's growing, right? So and there are no significant issues. You can, of course, like
that sounds like short-termism to me, though.
Yeah, in the short term, of course. But you know, it depends on Lukashenka by the end of the day. Because one of the main comparative advantages was, for example, the IT sector, and it's clearly his decision was to actually, or it was it's the thing that he did that actually he dismantled in a way this sector. And there are not so many comparative advantages these days. Maybe there are none of them actually. And once the Russian economy stops, it's a huge question. What does it mean for Belarusian economy?
Yeah, I mean, I've always wondered that. I mean, it's just, I don't mean to be offensive, but I always wonder, what does Belarus have to sell and to export in the future? It's not entirely clear to me what the commercial environment of future Belarus looks like. I don't really understand that.
No one understands.
Okay. What does mean?
No, the answer is that actually it's going to be a relatively huge crisis for the economy.
Okay. Sanctions. Would better sanctions have an effect? I'll ask for Skippers as well.
I don't know. I think that we all said it's double-edged sword, and in a way, sanctions help Russia to increase its influence. On the other hand, we understand as well, and the West has to punish the regime for doing that.
Of course.
So I think that yes, if we mean smarter, I think that, for example, let's say sanctions that were introduced against Belarusian airplanes, Belavia company, well, of course, there is a huge discussion whether it helped anyone or it just helped Russians. So, and I think that yes, the smarter the sanctions, the better.
In your initial remarks, Andrew, you seem to imply that we could do better.
Well, I think I also said that Belarusians are worried about indirect impact on their economy from Russian economic problems. And I think that Belarusians are better informed about those problems than we are, because there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in official Russian figures. The economy is nowhere near collapse, but it's not doing as well as Russia says it is, which is where the Belarusian calculation comes from. I also said that this is risk management. The economy is okay. I mean, I think next year's forecast is near 3%. So we're certainly not talking potential crisis, but just management of possible downside.
I don't believe you out, Alicia. Do you think Western sanctions could be better?
I'm not an expert as Grigor started, because I'm also going to start this. I'm not an expert in countermeasures, but I do think that the Western community has missed a couple of chances since 2020. I don't think it's time to correct the mistakes, and I don't think there is a proper way to do that without initiating a dialogue with the regime. So pulling off from the scenario that has been already started. But I do believe that the mistakes have been made when it comes to the speed of reaction, to the quality of the sanctions, and to the correspondence of the sanctions match between the actions and the immediate reaction.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got 15 minutes left and several questions online. I haven't seen anybody else in the room, but let me know. So Paul Hansbury, noted Belarus expert himself, has a question back to you, Riho. If Western states engage more with a regime, what do you see as the primary goal of engagement, given it would strengthen Lukashenko? So I often challenge you on this myself, don't I? I mean, so I take your view that there's engagement is there, but it is going to bolster him. He can crow about it. He can portray it. He can say, look what it is that I have done. He's got a narrative. He would have a narrative to work with. He's Paul. I don't know if it was because of you or he's mentioned it independently. Talks about the return of the ambassadors and as well. So I mean, what's the goal of the engagement? I think you're saying that the goal of the engagement is nothing to do with Lukashenko, but it's actually for the next generation. It's for post Lukashenko era. But I'm done. What's your mouth?
I think there are two main criteria. One is end of repression. The second one is the distancing from Russia. Maybe distancing from Russia would matter more, right? But this is our two main things. And I guess that we can't expect anything huge from the regime. Mm-hmm. But by the end of the day, even small changes they matter now. And even if we take, for example, end of repression, if we can imagine that Belarus society has 5 years to recover, it would be a great opportunity to try to change things once Lukashenko leaves.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. Andrew, I've got a spicy one for you, also from Paul. So back to Trump. We can't avoid it right now, of course. If the Trump administration develops a more realpolitik attitude towards Belarus, how far should the UK align with US policy? I know, right? That's what we're all asking ourselves on all sorts of issues, but it's got to come. But the question works on Belarus just as much as it does anywhere. So,
well, because we're asking that question on all sorts of issues, we're not likely to pick a general fight with the USA over Belarus,
right?
Because of all the big problems that we have. But if the USA is moving towards neglect, then it is actually easier to be more proactive. Because neglect has no veto of people being proactive. You just don't care. But if America moved first with, say, moving an ambassador back, then we might have a problem whether to follow on. I don't see that is a bigger question, a much bigger question than it is a question about Belarus.
Sure. But can I link in a question from Artyom Shreban, who we all know? He also asks a spicy one as well. It's Lukashenko at the potential peace talks, he says. How good or bad would that be for Belarusian long-term interests?
Well, we can't possibly have Minsk 3.
You think? I wouldn't put it past us.
I mean, Kiev had already ruled that out before February 2022.
I hope you're right.
Kiev now views Belarus as a co-aggressor. So it can't possibly be peace talks in that kind of way. Yeah. Belarus can't possibly be a host. Even Lukashenko's physical presence would not would be unacceptable for the Ukrainians. But they do talk to official Belarus. One thing that Belarus would be good at is whatever process sets in motion, thinking about how they can offer to facilitate it or play a constructive role, which is exactly what I'd expect them to do. Hosting, not likely. Hosting a Putin Trump summit, again, not likely, because other countries have offered.
Yeah.
Serbia. You can see the intent because the benefit is clear. But the process has to start before Belarus works out what to do.
Yeah, of course. Right, let's move on. Tim Schweier's question. Probably I don't know if to Rihor or Alessia. How significant is the newly empowered All Belarusian People's Assembly as a construct, I suppose it is for you, to step down as president while maintaining the control of the political direction of the country? You've mentioned it before. I don't think you mentioned it today, but you've mentioned it before.
Yeah. Well, it was introduced after the changes in constitution in 2022, and it was started functioning last year. And actually, it's doing pretty nothing right now. And I think de facto it doesn't exist. But I guess they already had the building built, so probably it will be used in the future by someone. But right now, it seems that they just created this infrastructure for the future succession, but as they are not going to success tomorrow, there is not much sense to actually use this institution.
No comment?
Yeah, just agree.
You good? Good. Unanimity, that's what I like. Okay, let's go to Hugo Brown. Could you comment on the influence of Russia with relation to war? We've done that, but I think he's looking for a comment on, and this goes back to your previous answer, Andrew, on Lukashenko's role in the Wagner crisis. Was it? I always had the impression that this wasn't a real role. It was sort of a virtual one, or an artificial role that was created. He needed to, Putin that is, needed to put a person in there to negotiate, supposedly, and there wasn't anything real about it. But do you differ?
Whether it's paradoxical or not, Belarus was useful in the resolution or the end game of that crisis because it is a sovereign country. Right? So you could just park these guys somewhere else. There wasn't Russia. That was useful, but it was short term. There's no way that Lukashenko wants Russian active paramilitaries on his territory long term, who could be, weaponized against him. And all the stuff about him negotiating, I think, was that was a lot of play acting in that. I don't think he really resolved the crisis. But again, his existence helped resolve the crisis.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Possibly a last question, I think. We're nearing the end. Anna Davidson, formerly of Oxford, I think, but in Washington, it seems. So I know we've partially answered it, but let's see if we can get a little bit more out of it. Do you recommend different approaches in priorities from the West for supporting Belarusians inside Belarus today, the diaspora and the democratic opposition, compared to preparing work for a new democratic Belarus? So how do we differentiate our support for the different kinds of non-systemic Belarusians inside and outside the country? Andy, again. Yes, you again, I'm afraid. At least, on the basis it's Western policy, but I'll come to the others.
My presentation was differentiated.
Yes, it was
about different policies for different things.
Yeah.
But also about maintaining the long-term possibility of them all coming back together. The other Belarus, now largely in exile, cannot be permanently in exile.
Right.
Otherwise, the entire country would be inverted inside out.
Sort of is, yeah.
So, yes, we need separate policies, but in order to try and prevent extreme divergence culminating in the impossibility of knitting everything back together.
Yes, you must have a view on this.
I'm pointing only to one thing that I think was not discussed today, is the role of the independent media, or rather, put it more broadly, content producers, that are the only direct connection between the Belarusians outside the country and Belarusians inside the country. Due to the independent media and bloggers and speakers, Belarusians actually receive information that is otherwise unavailable, filtered and spiced up with the ideology and other things. So I do think that it is necessary to review the approach to support of primarily independent media and content producers, especially now when a lot of media are losing its support due to structural systems of how donor community works, etc. And now with the risk of USAID and other big donors shutting down the programs, where I would like to, in the nearest future, to see more and more actors that are taking on proactive role in supporting the independent media, not in how to reestablish their work abroad and how to find the partners for advertising, etc. But more money needs to be there for the people who are now producing the materials for the Belarusians inside the country to cover their work, to cover their offices, etc. So this point, I think, is important, and they should be differentiated from the other groups of support.
Migo, chance.
I absolutely agree with what you said.
It does. In fact, there does seem to be an agreement amongst all Belarus watchers on this point. That have to be said. So this is good.
So I think that clearly should be different priorities for people who are outside or inside the country. But I think that the main priority of course, is people inside the country. These are who have more difficulties and more problems these days than people who are outside. And what we should do is to support them, and to support them by supporting independent media, by supporting human rights organizations, and people who can help people inside the country. And then actually we will be able to see more changes in the society in the future as well. And of course, we have to support the identity projects in the country, because by the end of the day, even if we come back to this discussion about how propaganda works or doesn't work in Belarus, one of the striking things that sometimes propaganda tries to change some core values of Belarusian identity, and then it faces the hugest problems, and that can be used by pro-democracy actors in Belarus. One clear example is, for example, the war, that actually, despite all of these years, despite of the propaganda, etc., we still see that the majority of Belarus society doesn't support the war. And that actually the thing that gives us hope. And if we can continue helping people inside, then we will be able to see more and more changes.
Very interesting. I like a prioritization, and I think it might come as a revelation to many, but there is a sort of a nascent isn't the right word, but a struggling, repressed, but nonetheless existent Belarusian civil society and media inside Belarus itself. And you're saying we should concentrate on them. So it's a good note to end on. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, panel, ladies and gentlemen, here in the room and online. That was a very full hour and a half. Great. Well done, Rihor, for thinking of it, the idea, setting it up. You did it well, along with Phoebe and Melania. Of course, you know, this is all down to you, as is our Belarusian existence, so to speak. And long may it continue through you. And I hope that we can get this team back together again and do something similar, particularly as and when sort of that change comes. But yeah, and yet at the same time, before 5 or 10 years, obviously. So, okay. Thank you very much indeed. And good evening, everybody.
Yeah.